Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points with Matt and Matt. We're doing something slightly different this week. I'm on Christmas break, so I actually have time to record a podcast or to do something that's not, getting graded by an underpaid, overappreciated college professor. College has made me very cynical, ladies and gentlemen. But that's not the point. The point is we're talking about a Adam Curtis documentary. This one was called All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace. I think that's a reference to a poem someone wrote a while back. And actually, it was a Keegan who introduced me to Adam Curtis. On Keegan's channel, you can find us talking about another Adam Curtis documentary, which is Can't Get You Out of My Head. I think Matt has listened to an episode or two of that discussion. This documentary is specifically about like how our relationship to technology and the idea that the universe functions as a system, or that the globe functions as a system and as a machine. This idea of the clockwork universe, which dates back to like the 18th century. The idea that God like wound the clock up and then left it just to run by itself. But then that was also influenced by the emergence of modern mathematics and computer science. And basically, Adam Curtis is making the point that we can't understand, or we shouldn't try to understand the universe, and we shouldn't try to understand ourselves as machines, and that to understand the universe and ourselves as machines, it fundamentally misses an important point of reality. Because actually, if you look at any Adam Curtis documentary, his whole like point is to get the audience to I guess recognize, in his view, that you can change the world. So Adam Curtis is constantly talking about how people feel like they're stuck and they can't do anything, and the world just goes on without a care about what they think or want. And I mean, I even noticed this in a lot of people my age, this sort of cynicism and pessimism and nihilism. And so Adam Curtis sort of, I think, wants to give people more agency. And he sees he sees the modern world as a place that takes away agency. And then one of the ways then, therefore, is this idea that humans are machines and the universe is a machine. So I'm going to start with the third and final episode, or just like make some comments on that, and I'll let Matt jump in, and we'll just go from there. And I want to start with the third episode because he talks about the evolutionary biologist Bill Hamilton. He's not that well known outside of the scientific community, but one of his proteges, Richard Dawkins, is very well known, because Richard Dawkins was put in the spotlight due to his first book, The Selfish Gene, which attempts to popularize Bill Hamilton's work. Because Bill Hamilton wanted to understand the problem of altruism. He wanted to understand why certain animals behave in ways like why certain animals will sacrifice themselves. If the idea is survival of the fittest and you need to pass on your genes in order to survive, then you should want to screw over your neighbor. You should want to screw over your competition and thereby ensure your own survival. But Bill Hamilton said, well, no, you need to you can understand altruism. You can understand self-sacrifice if you look at evolution from the perspective of the gene, because it's like if I sacrifice myself for my brother. It's like, well, sure, I'm dying. I'm not passing on my genes, but my brother and I share some genes. So in effect, I am still passing on genes. Um, that seems like a random aside, but Adam Curtis is sort of he want. Well, I got a little confused. I sort of really interpreted him as directly criticizing the science. My co-host was arguing that he actually thinks he was criticizing people's takes on the science. But I guess whatever Curtis's intention, um, I think we need to be very careful when we're like criticizing a scientific theory and making sure that we're not like letting politics slip into our critique. I don't think, because what I really hear Curtis saying is he's connecting, this idea of like Ayn Randian selfishness and Reaganomics with this idea that we are gene machines. And he's saying both sort of lead to this idea that we should be selfish. But I don't think that's what the evolutionary biology points to. And in fact, I think this understanding of evolution, since it explains altruism, it sort of at least signifies to me that why altruism is a good thing and why we should be altruistic, because it's in our nature. It's natural. I don't know. I see a lot of people on the left sort of criticize science through the lens of leftism. Not to say that Curtis is a leftist, but that is one thing I want to avoid when we're talking about public policy or social issues. We can let the science be the science without assuming that there's like a deeper ideological issue going on.
Okay. I'm just going to jump in on that because I think there is a well to discuss here, and this might clarify what I was kind of talking to you before the show. So I think parts 2 and 3 of the documentary are critiquing the idea of scientism, right? So it's not he's not critiquing the fundamental nature of science. He's critiquing the ways that people try to draw takeaways from it. So just some examples from the documentary. There's a whole part where and the part from the documentary is kind of old for like 2021 because it looks like it's something from the 90s. But it was IBM was kind of doing a study on animals and like a plane, and there's like a guy following around an animal, and he's noting what the animal takes a bite out of, how many bites, what type of plant it was, and they had a way to like look into like, not, it wasn't goats, but something like that, and look in and see what they'd been eating. And they're like, cool, we have all this data. And it's this idea that if you have enough data, you can understand the world. And that this is kind of popular in business communities because of the proliferation of technology and computers and stuff like that. It's like, if all you need is more data, this is like the big data movement. So that's a lot of stuff in part 2. And part 3 kind of shifts into talking about the human idea of, because of all this knowledge that we're now aware of, do we operate with a fatalistic mindset? And I don't think he's necessarily critiquing the science of what Richard Dawkins is saying. But the thing is, and this is something that you and I have argued about on the show a lot, is the popular imagination of the takeaways of Dawkins' points are this like weird fatalistic nihilistic impulse. Now you rightfully say, well, yeah, but you don't have to have that takeaway to Dawkins' work. And it's like, yeah, obviously you don't have to have that takeaway. But he's critiquing, and Curtis and I are both critique the idea that like maybe you shouldn't have that takeaway because that takeaway is kind of arbitrary. Now, the popular conception when they hear something like, well, our drives are based on these innate things that we don't control and we're not aware of, and they're acting in the background and they're really pulling the triggers, that can make a lot of people have certain philosophical views arise from it. I don't think that's justified. Curtis doesn't think that's justified, and he thinks that those ideas are bad for the world, like those nihilistic thoughts or fatalistic, that you don't mean anything. But that's not critiquing the science of what Dawkins is saying, right? It's critiquing scientism. It's like all part 2 is him critiquing these people who create these systems and think they understand things that don't. And then he's like, then he's critiquing the worldview that people extract from certain scientific ideas. Doesn't mean the science is wrong. It means the ideas you extract is incorrect. And I'm glad you brought up like progressive lefties that hate on science. But when they hate on it because it says something that's like inconvenient to a narrative. But what he's really critiquing isn't anything like actually pointing out how data points are, wrong. He's not trying to tell you, no, we misunderstand chemistry. He's kind of saying we're taking away things from these scientific facts that aren't helpful to humanity and are still arbitrary and they don't follow. We shouldn't think of the world in this way. Scientism tells you to think of the world in that way. I wouldn't say you're a proponent of scientism, though. I'd say like the hardcore mainstream economists, those people at IBM that were doing those types of studies, right? And then I would say like people who I don't want to badmouth the guy we've talked about who's the antinatalist, but he's almost his takeaway from certain things is almost like similar. But I think scientism and science are like two distinct realms. So maybe that's where I see Curtis landing kind of unknowingly in those circles.
No, I mean, I think that's you certainly have to distinguish between science and scientism. Science is it's a very niche, very specialized process, attempting to understand, very specific things in a specific way. But as you say, I mean, it when you try to look at things from a more big picture perspective. So this is like to use this analogy, it's like when physicists are looking for the theory of everything. Scientists are trying to, or those people are trying to understand the way of connecting, the physical laws and chemical laws that seem to contradict each other. And the whole point of Curtis's documentary is to explore this mentality of trying to understand everything from every minute nail and bolt and screw and lever from the perspective of the entire machine, the entire device. Now, it's like at some level, I guess I'm not terribly interested in the question: is the universe does the universe run like a clock, or does the universe run like a machine? It very well could, but that's not a helpful way to think about it a good bit of the time, because of how ignorant we are in the long run. How ignorant we are about the rise and fall of particularly in social and like political issues. How ignorant we are about the rise and fall of civilizations. How ignorant we are about the influence of certain economic policies in the short term and the long term. How ignorant we are about how the climate functions. So, like to bring up ecology, which I mentioned earlier, the ecologists, I think it was like in probably the 70s or so, they were it was this idea of the ecosystem, but particularly the self-correcting ecosystem, and the way the ecologists got the data to best represent this model was to simplify it significantly, to have the most simplistic possible ecosystem. Sort of, kind of like using Occam's razor, I guess. The best explanation is the simplest one. Like, simplify the data. And when they did that, they saw that what the computer models seemed to indicate was, well, yeah, then there has to be a certain ratio of like, grasshoppers and antelope and cheetah, and they're all like feeding each other information based on their behavior. And it's all it all stabilizes. There might be a flood, or there might be too many, antelope in, 1 year, but eventually it always goes back to a steady state. The universe, in other words, in this view, tends towards order. But then when ecologists tried to like increase the data, instead of creating, the most simple models, when they tried to make their models even more complex, what they saw was chaos. What they saw was ecosystems are extremely dynamic. They're constantly changing. They don't stay the same. They don't go back to equilibrium after a flood or after a forest burns down. There's just a new ecosystem that springs up. I think that's and so again to you're talking about like people's attitude towards science versus like the actual science, and I think people still have that like 1970s view of nature and of man. Yeah, the documentary brings up the Gaia hypothesis, like the whole planet is an ecosystem, or the whole planet is a self-correcting organism. I mean, I think it should be perfectly obvious why that's an absurd claim. We have to like get past, I guess, the thinking about things in this way of system building, particularly on a grand scale, because of how little we don't know. That's ultimately what I'm trying to get across.
Yeah. So the specific part in the documentary you're talking about, I found very frustrating as like a person who wanted to like think hard about what they were putting forward and the implications of it, because they were just kind of saying like, okay, you have this impression that nature is in order unless we kind of mess it up, and then it's like, but the more data we took in, the more things seemed chaotic or random or unpredictable, and like to me. And this is why I credit a lot of my thoughts to Taleb, like in terms of thinking about things about fragility or robust or anti-fragile. It's like you can imagine that if you took like a sample of businesses and there was an economic crisis, a certain amount of businesses go under. But then like the restaurant industry itself is robust, because like even if 10 restaurants go under, it's like, yeah, but the industry is still stable. So a lot of these things about nature, it's like, what analytical frame of reference are you using to call it something with order? It's like the real thing is there are like equilibriums and there are reactions to things, right? So like if all of a sudden there weren't enough food for a certain type of animal to consume because of like a fire or a flood or something like that, you might see their population like naturally decrease, or like the rate of growth would slow, because it's like, okay, well now when they have offspring, only a certain amount live. And then you see these like natural corrections. Or are these corrections order, or is that like order, or is this chaos, right? Because they're like changing and adjusting given different circumstances. It's not like it's static, right? Things are adjusting. And it's like all sorts of species have been wiped out. So not every species is anti-fragile, but like life on Earth is like seems pretty anti-fragile. But a lot of species before humans got involved, like a certain disaster could wipe them out. There's like a lot of chains of species that don't really get going. And it's like, well, there are reasons why, and so forth. And that's just what I was thinking about. Because it's like, well, yeah, you can't have a unified theory of nature is order and this is good. It's like, no, all these things are various systems with a different level of like fragility. And ones that persist for thousands and thousands of years are much more likely to be anti-fragile for obvious reasons. Yeah, I could leave it there for a minute. But there's more that's like spins off that too about the types of models they're making and what they're trying to say with these models. It's like, well, maybe the things that you can't observe are the things that make it anti-fragile, right? You can only measure certain things. Maybe those things aren't helpful indicators at all. You think you're measuring everything that's obvious to you, but it's like you don't know what you're missing if the species is tens of thousands of years old and you don't understand all the interactions in every circumstance. You only are observing in a summer in 1 year on these plains what this goat eats. You don't know what it would eat if it was like in the worst circumstance possible. That might be why that species is prevalent. Like that really bothered me in like an intellectual way. Like, but that's like the flaw of scientism and systems, right? If you're too literal, you're too narrow, and you're too rigid, of course you can drop a narrative. And that's why the systems they put forward usually fail, right? Then you end up with the fragile model. So yeah.
Well, I think I guess what's sort of alarming about the concept of system building, or the way system building has been used in the modern world, is in Curtis's view, it perpetuates the status quo. It gives the idea that there have to be these this small group of people pulling levers to make sure everything goes as smoothly as possible. And every one of us is just this small part in this grand system. Which, when you put it like that, it almost sounds collectivistic. But actually, I think what Curtis is really arguing, that this is a problem of individualism, because because it's the idea that free interactions, free association, free choice will lead to that equilibrium. So, like in the first episode, it mentions the election of President Clinton, and President Clinton, like most presidents, came into office with the idea that he's going to use his political power to really, change the system, to really help people, in the way that politicians have said they were going to do for a while now, but in that old school way, like Bill Clinton was. I don't think when Bill Clinton came into office, he sort of understood, I guess, the power dynamics of politics in the 1990s and early 2000s. So he sort of had this old-fashioned idea that it's politicians that are the most important thing. Any one politician and their actions are what truly matters. But then, he has a meeting with Alan Greenspan, who suggests to him that we need massive budget cuts in the government, so more money is going to be flowing into the economy. So more free, there will be greater free agency, and there will be a greater amount of profits. And then I think it also mentions that he was in a bath looking over the numbers, and he saw no numbers, or he saw no increase in profit. But then he decided that, well, that means that the computer models are working so well that we can't even properly quantify the increase in profit. So it's a weird dynamic where it's like the individual is, front and center, but it's also, coupled with the idea that we need elites to be managing everything. It's a bit of a tension, but I guess there is a way to that those things make sense. I mean, I'm not defending that worldview, but I'm saying that you can put those two things together and understand why people view the world in that way.
Yeah. So if the point of that was to say individualism is concerning because that means one individual can have like a disproportionate amount of impact, like as in if Greenspan does the wrong thing, then that's bad for a ton of people, and that dehumanizes a bunch of individuals, and this is a problem of individualism. It really seems to me like a power problem, and I really thought part one of this documentary was like very bad. And that's like, it's bad enough to where if anybody had ANCAP or libertarian sympathies, it's like it'd be hard to recommend this for any reason, because I don't think they'd be willing to trust the credibility of the rest of the documentary after part one. The tie-ins to Rand were like very odd, because it kind of took advantage of the fact that Greenspan had this history with Rand, even though none of Greenspan's policies are in any way inspired by Rand in any way that makes sense. And that's like something that, like, if you read criticisms of Greenspan by any libertarian organization, like none of them are willing to remotely defend any of Greenspan's actions. It literally kind of implied that his policy was Randian, and then the next clip he said like it talked about how he was going to cut interest rates to 0%. And then like it's like, okay, like this is very poorly explained. Just like I thought that was borderline anti-knowledge. Like I found that very frustrating.
Well, I think we can't forget though that we live in 2021, and so this libertarian conservative split is more it's more prevalent in our minds than it was. I mean, and not even, you couldn't even say Ayn Rand was libertarian because she was an objectivist, which is a slightly separate thing. But her views, I would say, have been more influenced by, or libertarians have been more influenced by Rand than, say, modern conservatives have been. But it's the mindset. It's this idea of business tycoons concerned with profit will, be heroes because they will contribute to this, social system, this self-correcting social system, of a collection of people who are behaving in a free way. That's the connection. It's a philosophical worldview more than anything. It's a view of human nature. It's a view of social relations that I think Alan Greenspan and Ayn Rand share, and that's what I think is concerning to me.
I think one of the more obvious takeaways from any of Rand's work is something along the lines of, look how government inhibits both individuality and progress, and it's often for arbitrary or corrupt reasons. So it's like, okay, cool. I'm comfortable with that being the takeaway from Rand if I had to sum it up in one sentence, the majority of her work. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of stuff on selfishness that I also thought this documentary did awful, but that's how I'd sum up Rand. Now, the issue I have is then people take in her stories, she is pro-entrepreneur. And then they conflate entrepreneurs in her stories that are heroes with the amalgamation of corporate entity and government that lies in bed with each other and is a corrupt being. Well, her stories aren't about corrupt business owners being good people. And then everybody points to corrupt business owners that benefit from like bad government management or screwing around based on like bad government incentives. And they say, look, this is Rand in nature. And it's like, well, no, because her whole book villainizes the government and like bad interference in, policies. So it's like, okay, well, look at these evil organizations that came about because of bad government incentives. And it's like, let's blame Rand, like it's a corporation. So this is bad Randianism. And it's like, no, Rand doesn't defend corporations like Enron, because Enron is like got away with all sorts of things because of bad standards that were set. And then they took advantage of those standards and then lied to work around them because of the incentive structure they lived in. So it's just like all that stuff getting tied in with like Rand is like just bizarre to me. And it's like this weird straw man. And I have a hard time getting past it. And the reason why I don't think Curtis is unique in falling victim to this, because I think this is kind of like the popular conception just lacks that nuance about Rand. But one of the things that made me like not willing to give him the benefit of the doubt is there's this interview with an ex-Randian woman, and she says something along the lines of, they're talking about Ayn Rand's personal life. And the guy says something, or she says something like, I was asking myself if I could press a button that would make Ayn Rand happy with her personal life romantically, would I press it? I realized, yes, I would. And the interviewer says something like, but that's altruism. And then she's like, exactly. And it's like, no, you would press the button because you want Ayn Rand to feel better. And that means you feel something from Ayn Rand feeling better, or for helping any person. And even by Ayn Rand's definition of selfishness and all those things, that is not altruism because it would make her feel better. So it's like this ex-Randian goes on a TV show, like calls something good that's obviously good to everyone altruism, when by Randian's parameters of language that she lays out in her worldview isn't altruism. So it's like, okay, that's fine. You can squabble on the definition of the word, but you're not critiquing Rand's work, that you're just strawmanning it. So then when the rest of the documentary kind of goes on from that and then relates other things to Randianism, it's like I can't give this the benefit of the doubt. Like it lost credibility on that front with understanding the basics of Rand's work. And it's not because I love Rand's work. Like it's not super meaningful to me. But it's just like a clear lack of comprehension. That is the popular narrative understanding of her work. Like I thought it was lazy, really. And it was the lowest quality thing of the documentary because there are interesting things to take away from it. But it was really hard to get past that stuff and the Greenspan stuff.
I mean, I'll give your criticisms this much at least. I think you can reconcile selfishness and altruism. I don't think that's a hard square to circle. And I think Ayn Rand attempts to do that. But my issues with Ayn Rand are issues that we've talked about many, many times before, which is I don't think people can free themselves from the political and religious forces that Ayn Rand wants them to. I mean, she was from Russia. I mean, Russia had a famous revolution and in many ways, the revolution did not do what it promised. And so she saw pathological collectivism, in her, that was front and center in her life, which is why her family moved. And so I think, not to like psychoanalyze Ayn Rand here, but I think she did something which is understandable. She was revolted by that pathological collectivism, and so in her intellectual worldview, she went in the opposite direction as far as she possibly could. But I can't get around the fact that to be provocative about it, I guess individuals aren't free agents, and we don't really. Life isn't about free association and just free choice. And this is why I guess I'm pro Curtis, insofar as I don't think human beings work in that. Like, this is the issue with the system building that he's talking about. I don't think people behave in that self-correcting, free associative way. I think we're always being influenced by certain forces, certain, whether that's like your nation state or your family or your friends or your religion, or your race or your gender or your sexuality. And I think that any social structure, any hierarchy, any collective, and we're all part of collectives, unfortunately or fortunately, are inherently coercive. Like there's some at some point, the buck stops there, and someone's gonna, put a bayonet in your face if you don't do something. Now in the United States, I can basically do whatever I please within reason. So, well, not to defend the United States there, but I know might seem slightly out of left field, and I know we've discussed similar things in the past, but that's ultimately my criticism of Ayn Rand and modern day individualism. I think the individualism we experience now is pathological. It's the opposite extreme of what Ayn Rand experienced in Russia.
Okay, I'm going to zoom out a little bit, and then I'll zoom back into one part of what you said. So I think acceptable reading of what Curtis is pushing forward is, and I'll include my little qualifications. But it seems like, and I think this is part of what you're getting at, is part one is him setting up Randianism and that type of what the popular conception of capitalism is, being in a way pro-elites. There's a part specifically where he calls out, it has Joseph Stiglitz, who I think is, I'm not going to say anything. Actually, I'm just going to move on. So Joseph Stiglitz says something along the lines of, the IMF bails out these places. They have brief stability, but then all the people who lent the money can get that, it's pretty much like the IMF gives a loan to a failing country. The country is stable enough for people who have invested in that company to recoup all their losses. Then the country has massive currency inflation, and then all the debts fall on the people of that country. And all the privileged people, all the elitists were able to make their buck and get out safe because of the IMF. So that's so part one is him setting up this construction of capitalism is evil, elites take advantage of our system. Then part two is, here's why systems don't work in the way that people want systems to work. Here's the way that all these planning devices are fallible. And then part three is him really coming back and being like, you matter, you can make a difference, nihilism is bad. So it's kind of like, he's laying out something that's essentially elites are bad, certain levels of grand world planning is bad, and you still matter, but he's trying to put it forward in some sort of progressive way because capitalism is bad in his story. Now, what I would say to one of the claims you brought up is you said thinking in systems, like how Curtis kind of points out, isn't something that is particularly successful, right? So it's like you come up with these grand systems and you expect them to work in this way, and you look at the feedback loops. Yet the predictions that the people in the documentary talk about are often wrong, or they're like, actually, we couldn't come up with anything useful from this. And this is actually like weirdly a Hayekian, a Misesian, or like a Taleb-like point about knowledge and information. But then you said something along the lines of, I don't think free association is corrective. And I think that's kind of where you and I start missing each other. Is I'm like, yes, the reason why I'm anti-centralized system is because systems are not, all systems that are like formalized in forms of like governments are too rigid. They do not have ways to self-correct when something isn't working the way it is. They have so much noise that they often don't know why things aren't working, and they often just do what is politically palatable, which is not usually what is the thing the system would need, even if you were trying to curate it correctly. So it's like, these are the reasons why government is always a malfunctioning system. Even if it's surviving, it's still malfunctioning. Now, when you have free association, whenever something doesn't go as planned, people make corrections for it. So like somebody decides, somebody buys something because they don't know if the product's good or not. Fortunately, when we make expensive, decisions, we have a system where a lot of times you have ways to sample it, or you have certain types of guarantees. But if you buy a different type of bread at the store because your preferred bread is out of stock and you don't like it, you never buy it again, right? So you have like corrected in a very minor way that nobody even thinks about as a system correction. But it's like, well, no, you had to make this change. You did this thing. You have more information. You have taken action to correct this. You now know, I don't like this brand of bread, right? So in the most minute ways that there's too much data for, people make small corrections all the time. People watch certain movies. They think, I like scary movies, and they see a different type of scary movie they don't like, and they're like, actually, my definition is I like art house horror movies. Comedy horror movies are awful. And now they don't watch any more comedy horror movies. And then people do the same in relationships. They go out on several dates, right? They decide, you know what, I can't see myself being with this person. I don't trust them the way I want to trust somebody. They self-correct. So like there are times where relationships are coercive, like in businesses or whatnot, right? If you want to argue from like a certain leftist worldview in a principled way. I'm talking about the way that just natural relationships work in like the modern world. When people have the opportunity to say no to things to the highest degree, they can self-correct for like their personal taste and optimization. That's why all the systems he talks about are kind of like useless when it ties in the government. And this is why, like, if you can, like, Greenspan is trying to curate a system. That's why he cuts interest rates to zero. Well, guess what? Now you've obscured the true interest rate. You put a random one up there, that's going to cause problems. If you let the interest rate be the natural interest rate, then people could operate accordingly. And then you don't have zombie firms that nobody actually wants, but they're propped up because they can get a 0% loan. So that's like the grand failing of central planning. It's kind of what Curtis is unintentionally talking about. I think the only answer to that is free association. And it's like, sure, bad stuff still happens, but it's not catastrophic like the dollar crashing or something. So yeah, that's kind of where I start losing you.
Oh, well, I'm actually glad I went down this rabbit hole then, because this was the part of the documentary which I thought you would be at least moderately more sympathetic with, or at least you could see yourself agreeing with Curtis, even if you guys sort of come to a similar conclusion about, at least central planning. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is, and this is sort of wrapping around a topic which we've talked about for a while now, and it's sort of hard to, I guess, move past. There's sort of a wall when I bring up power, or when someone brings up power on the podcast, and what that means. And I'm going to use an example that Curtis uses that you wouldn't be sympathetic to at all to try to illustrate what I'm trying to say. And communes, the idea that people could come together, like in these communes, and sort of less high, less or no, there would be less or no hierarchy. People would sort of work out their, issues with each other one-on-one. There's a lack of coercion because people are choosing to be in these communes. And I think, he says something to the effect of they can last anywhere from, or communes generally lasted anywhere from like 6 months to 3 years, but it was very rare for a commune to last 3 years. I think it was around 6 months is the average. And why, did a commune only last 6 months on average? power dynamics. People eventually, because of the absorbing individualism, absorbing the idea that you care about yourself. I mean, and you can care about friends and family and all that stuff in individualism as well, but you're focused on your little microcosm and you're not worried about other people's microcosm, right? So people in positions of power, or people would create positions of power or fall into positions of power in these communes, and then they would abuse that position of power, and people wouldn't, come up to people wouldn't try to dismantle those positions of power. People wouldn't try to defend the victims of those people who were in positions of power because they were supposed to focus on their own little microcosm. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about free association. You can't. That's not self-correcting, because power dynamics are always going to get involved, and power dynamics often do destabilize, human relations. Now you can't get away from power dynamics. Like, this is just a fact of life. But that's why, like, I'm not. That's what I'm labeling as pathological, or that's why I'm criticizing what I'm calling pathological individualism. I think it rests on this idea that we're sort of, people have a more or less equal degree of influence or ability to fight for their own interests in the world, and that's just not the case.
So I think part of what the story you're saying loses me is just because I heard a conclusion that was self-correcting, which is that the commune, like the commune, has problems. A person abused their power, and then since it was a voluntary agreement, people left, and then it fell apart. And to me, what I'm hearing is, you have a structure, you attempting to flatten hierarchies. Eventually, once the hierarchy becomes not flattened and somebody abuses their power, everybody leaves. It's okay that everybody leaves if a system is bad. That's what you want. That is the corrective nature, right? So if you have any type of authoritarian regime put in something and it doesn't work, you don't have the option to leave. And that's like the big concern I have with statism, right? Is because when stuff goes haywire, it's like you're at their will. If you have a commune that's freely associated and it starts going to hell because you let one guy have too much responsibility and he's doing stuff you don't like, well, if it's truly a free association, you can still leave. And that is the corrective. That's the corrective nature that makes that qualitatively different than a statist organization, right? So that's why it's like, I hear that and I'm like, yeah, it does sound like power corrupted a situation. Fortunately, because it was a freely associated commune, people were allowed to leave. And then people were allowed to hopefully find people who were better people that fit their interests and their desires and their needs more. And it's, this is like, I guess I don't want to get into maybe things on like management or like defining roles, but the way that people conceptualize a flat hierarchy and everybody has their equal share of it, it's like, well, if people are doing things that different value to a group, maybe it's like these things shouldn't be called equal, and maybe power in the end should be equal if everybody wants it to. But I guess the question that the example kind of rose to me is, how important is flattening out hierarchies? Because there are people who are okay with their relationships that are, in a technical power like analysis, subordinate, right? You meet people and it's like, well, if you work at a company with the CEO, your relationship is subordinate to some degree to somebody else. And a lot of people are okay with their roles. And I don't necessarily think in terms of their own well-being, in terms of like society, if you think of like output into a society in terms of how productive they are, but then you also consider like how much people can actually do if you do coordinate a system that does have levels of hierarchy. It's like, how much more can get done? Therefore, does that raise people's well-being? So it's like, what are you willing to sacrifice to flatten out hierarchies in terms of other people's preferences, right? And that's where I kind of say, I can't make that decision. God, no. Let people do what they want. If people want to join a commune voluntarily, sure, they might put less out into the world than me, who works in a corporation, because I might be a very important role in the widget making line or something, right? I'm making a lot of stuff, and I'm integral, even though I'm a cog. In a commune, you might be like doing your own thing, but it might be deeply inefficient, and it might not make you happy, and you might get less in terms of like other things that improve your quality of life. How much does it matter to a random person that they're subordinate to somebody else? I don't know. It's different for everyone, right? That's I think the the tipping point of this conversation.
Well, I don't know if you want to move on to a different aspect of the documentary. I guess I'll just add this, and if you want to add any final thoughts to this part, we can, or you can. Well, yeah. So I sort of use, I guess, the example then of eliminating all hierarchies, which is not what you're sympathetic to. I guess my final contention, and I'm having trouble, I would be more than willing, I guess, to have someone persuade me otherwise. But my final contention is, and this is sort of what I get when I watch an Adam Curtis documentary. I think people have this idea of history that's like progressive, and I think again this partly stems from the Enlightenment. That reason and science are moving us forward. We're better than we were in the Middle Ages, obviously. So this idea that we're getting better, society's getting better, human life is getting better, and we're becoming more humane. We're becoming more good, I guess. And this is sort of where my inner Foucault comes in, and this is what I think Adam Curtis is trying to say. It's like, well, no, the old influences of money, power, hierarchy, all these things still have as much influence on our lives as they ever did. We might not have a king anymore. We might not have a clergy. We might not have a king abusing his power, or a clergy abusing their power. But things are not that different in the world than they ever were. And that's why I'm saying that I think the fundamental, I guess, misunderstanding of people, of modern man, is this idea we can get away from coercion. You can I think coercion exists everywhere. I think hierarchies are always based on coercion. I think governments, religious, groups, just the society as a whole. There are people telling you what to do. There are people who can, enact, punishment against you if you do something or don't do something. So it's sort of a question then, if I take up Curtis's challenge and say, do I want to change the world? Then I have to ask myself, how do I confront this fact on the ground that coercion is something I don't think I or anyone can ever get away from, just because of the nature of man.
Well, I'm willing to grant the comment in regards to hierarchy. So I do think hierarchy is inevitable. And I wasn't sure if you were going to go there. And I was going to raise a funny example, which I'll just bring up anyways, even though I know. So I'm not going to force you to defend the implications of it. But I like watching movies. So I imagined what would a movie look like if it was made without a hierarchy? And it's well, you couldn't have a director, because everybody would have to be the director and everybody would have to be every role, right? Because the directors and then the producers are all the people who curate what the final cut of the movie looks like. And you have to make so many decisions that they can't all be collectively made unless every movie was this weirdly democratic venture. But then you have to think, well, who made the decision for who gets on the movie in the first place, right? How do you cast a movie democratically? Well, you have to have people in the beginning making the call of who gets in, unless everybody gets in. So it's you can't make, I watched this really odd movie. David Lynch made the movie Blue Velvet, and it's just this obscenely weird movie. Well, who can make that movie? David Lynch can make that movie. Well, if you don't let David Lynch be the head of that hierarchy, but you're not getting something like Blue Velvet in any type of democratically organized movie making project. You're just not, or it doesn't have the same impact because you don't understand what his vision is for it. But I agree with you. I think hierarchies are inevitable, really, in the production of really anything. You end up having to do that. So I guess the question that raises for me that I think is, I just kind of want to ask it. I don't necessarily want to argue with your answer, but I guess I'm curious, is just because you are labeling, hierarchies as inherently coercive, and that in talking to me and ANCAP that coercion is it's a word that's loaded in a certain way, but the way that I try to be sympathetic in my head when you say that is words can have definitions, and each word can have a different degree, right? So we just had a conversation about power. Well, like, I mean, a 4-year-old has power in the sense that if the 4-year-old thinks that he wants to punch me in the nuts, a 4-year-old could walk up to me and punch me in the nuts, like he's in the same room as me, right? So even though you'd say, well, Matt, you could beat the tar out of a 4-year-old, it's like, okay, well, there's a power scale. And I'm at a 10 in relation to this 4-year-old that I could, kill, because I'm just a large man. But this 4-year-old, I mean, he's not completely defenseless. Like, he's never going to win in the end, but he could still punch me in the nuts. Okay, well, that would suck. So let's rate him as a 2. So I guess what I'm willing to say is almost every descriptive word when we talk about things in English, right? Everything is relative. So like somebody could say that their ex was abusive or violent. Okay, but like, some people are 10, some people are 6. 6 is still bad, but it's like these words can mean different things to different extents. So I guess what I'm willing to put forward is certain levels of coercion are more acceptable for good reasons. And if I was going to broaden out coercion to include maybe the things you'd want to include, it'd be, okay, well, maybe there's levels, maybe there's scales, maybe there's ultimate coercion, maybe there's passive coercion. Okay, well, since coercion is inevitable because hierarchy is, maybe I'm okay with passive coercion. So maybe I don't really disagree with you unless you're doing a weird equating of all levels of coercion, right? So if you're saying, well, Matt, your rule is you're not okay with any coercion, I count this as coercion. It's like, okay, well, maybe if I count that as coercion, these things are qualitatively different, and maybe they're different types of coercion or different degrees of coercion. And maybe there is a good reason to draw the line at some point because, as you said, hierarchies are inevitable, and I think I agree with that, and I would be very hard-pressed to disagree with that. So how do you feel about, I don't know, thinking about things in terms of degree instead of with, I guess, an absolute word and in relation to hierarchies and coercion?
I guess I want to start like with the definition I'm using, just so we're clear. I would. This is just a Wikipedia definition, but I think it's it's enough. Coercion is compelling a party to act in an involuntary manner by use of threats, including force, or the Oxford language definition: the practice of persuading someone to do something by using force or threats. That's the monopoly. I'm stuttering. The monopoly on violence is, the people talk about the state having that monopoly on violence. I'm sort of saying, for people to be in society is you're going to have to be forced to do something or other, even if you don't want to do it, or you're gonna be cast out of that community, or you're gonna be thrown in a jail cell or whatever. Like obviously, I mean, I think I do agree with you. Then, I mean, I don't think all forms of coercion are legitimate. I still don't think someone should be thrown in jail for smoking a joint, because I think that's I don't think it does much damage to the community. Like people they outlawed alcohol in the the early part of the 20th century because they thought it was harming the community. It's like, well, I think alcohol probably is harming it more than marijuana. So I'm not that I don't see it as so much of a social harm to, force someone to smoke a marijuana. So I'm going to say, don't throw someone in a cage just because they got high. But I just wanted to make that point clear. That's sort of something I've been building up to for a while in my reading and my thinking about social relations. I mean, Foucault, to bring him up again, people associate him with radical leftism, and they think he was extremely pro-proletariat and hated all forms of power and hierarchy. Well, actually, if you read Foucault, he doesn't even say power is bad. He's saying, I want people to acknowledge where power lies. I want people to acknowledge the power relations inherent in everything, whether it's the student and the professor, or parent-child, or a couple in a relationship. So that's sort of what I'm doing. We can agree not all coercion is created equal, but I want to point out that coercion never goes away, and therefore that's why I think it's fundamentally flawed to speak about free association.
See, I just think I think that just adds steps. So I think I just have to I think you just have to qualify more than if you use that framework, I guess, to make the same points that I would normally make colloquially without making qualifications for. Like, and this is maybe a little bit of an aside point, and I just want to mention it because I think it's interesting in maybe a philosophical way. But when you think about like what people do, like in a quote unquote voluntarily way, a lot of times it involves trade-offs, right? So, but when people are asked, well, do you actually want to do that? It's imagining a world with no trade-offs. So to bring it back to the example of me beating up a 4-year-old because it's funny. So why not bring it up? If somebody said, hey, do you want to punch this 4-year-old in the head? I'd be like, well, no, I don't. Like, I don't have this intrinsic desire to punch a 4-year-old in the head. Well, somebody can walk in, and this is maybe a leftist point, would be like, okay, well, Matt, I'm going to give you $1 million if you punch that kid in the head, and there's no charges will be levied towards you because of whatever is related to this, universe, this hypothetical. So the only cost is however bad I feel about punching this 4-year-old in the head and then willing myself to do it. You could say, well, Matt, you don't want to punch the 4-year-old in the head. It's like, well, I don't because I don't have intrinsic desire to, but $1 million means it's not really punching a 4-year-old. It's comparing a 4-year-old to like 12 years of working in an office job, right? So I'd rather work 12 years in an office job or, like punch this 4-year-old in the head and get enough money to not work for a decade. And then if I said, I want to punch the kid, you could say, well, you've been coerced. And it's like, well, I've been presented a trade-off that me as an individual have decided what to do based on the trade-off. Is there like a weird platonic value to where if you are offered anything, the action like that is the true value of the action? And it's like, or is everything realistically a trade-off? And is the fact that it's a trade-off coercive? It's like, in a way, anybody with $1 million to offer me might have a lot of power over me if I'm willing to do a lot of things for $1 million. It's like, yeah, that's true. If people have a lot of money, they can get people to do stuff. So that's the way that, like, it makes you powerful. Does that mean it's coercive? Well, it's like, well, no, because you have to want my money first, right? You have to want this for your own desires. And you are making the decision to say, like, you know what? I will take that $1 million. I can buy a lot of cool stuff and be really lazy and go on a bunch of cool trips if I do the thing I wouldn't have done for free. And I think that's acceptable. And framing it as coercion, I'm okay with, but I think that's qualitatively different than, threatening to punish somebody or threatening to, do like significant negative things towards them. Well, once you take it from the positive to, I can either choose neutral state or choose something that I actually want and I'm actually in favor of, or it's like, here's something that you wanted to do, but now we're actually going to change it from you wanted to do this naturally, and now you face a huge penalty if you do it. Then that's where it's like, okay, maybe this is a little concerning, especially if the thing you wanted to do was smoke a joint with your friends and watch a really bad comedy, right? And it's like, okay, maybe the fact that there are these extreme negative consequences could be more coercive, right? Or financial penalties. But when it's in the positive way, then I have a hard time interpreting it as coercion in the way that it is for the negatives. So maybe you can call one positive coercion and one negative coercion, as in sticks versus carrots. And maybe I'm not as offended of people using carrots and not sticks. So maybe that's just food for thought. That was off the top of my head while you were talking. I kind of put that together. I don't know how much I'll stand by that when I listen back, but I just think that might be that might be the wrinkle that really characterizes a distinction that I think is worth mentioning.
So I guess I'm reminded of another part about in the final episode, where it talks about the population geneticist George R. Price, and so this is me sort of like being autistic, but I remember the biographer of Price. He talks about like how Price kills himself. So basically, like to I guess shorten his life into a couple sentences. He was one of the people who tried to understand like Bill Hamilton's theories about how evolution works mathematically, and he also tried to think about it from like a systems perspective. But and then like later in his life, like he converted to Christianity, and he started like to dislike his work in evolutionary biology because of what he thought of, because of scientism and what he thought were the philosophical implications of it, selfishness, eugenics, and whatnot. And then he like, spent the rest of his life like giving homeless drunks like his shoes on his feet and the coats in his closet, letting them like live in his house, and like and then he like killed himself in a very like specific way. And the biographer that they were interviewing was like, that was free will, because his genes didn't tell him to kill himself in that very specific, esoteric, painful way. Take that, people who don't like free will. And I mean, I guess this connects to what you're saying, because again, like I'm wanting people to recognize whatever they think about this concept of freedom, or whatever they think about like the role of government in their lives, how influenced we are by things outside our control, and how I think people's view of concepts like free will can lead you to think about politics in certain ways that aren't necessarily true or helpful. I mean, I've said in the podcast before, I do believe in the concept of, or I think we can talk about the idea of changing the world. I don't have to speak of it, in a normative way necessarily. I don't have to say we should, but I can say we can. We have that ability. The world as it is not as it always has been or as it always will be. And I think it's perfectly legitimate for people to use the influence they have to, change the world in the way that they see fit. But people just sort of smuggle in, certain, I think, concepts that make it more hard to talk about these issues than it has to. And so, again, like I think the Ayn Rand, like objectivism, individualism, even like Alan Greenspan and his, separate view of like corporate or his view of like elite control of systems. I think a lot of it does stem from this concept of free will, which is at most questionable for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. Now, we don't have to get into a long discussion about the nature of free will, but I'm if no one takes anything else from this podcast, or like, what I really like about this documentary again is the ability of Curtis to help you think about certain assumptions you have, or certain assumptions the politicians have, or the businessmen have, and maybe what other assumptions we could have, because it is a work of art, right? He is putting forward a narrative. He's putting forward a story. He's selecting some pieces of information and not selecting other pieces of information. So you don't, but you don't look at a documentary. You shouldn't look at a documentary and think this is pure, unadulterated reality. But Adam Curtis is sort of playing the role of Socrates here, and the audience is, whoever Socrates is talking to on any given day. He's asking questions more than offering solutions. That's what I loved about it so much, and that's what I'm trying to impart in this episode.
Yeah, I would just add on to that. I mean, intellectual curiosity. If you have the inclination towards it, it's a good thing. He definitely raises points, and the things that I push back on are more nominal and literal, and maybe the implied takeaways from them, if there are any. You're more romantic about the idea of documentaries. Anything that attempts to touch the non-fiction realm, I'm
not romantic at all about documentaries, actually.
Well, I mean, you'd say you're not because you'd say you're right? So you're saying you're not being romantic because that's true. But it's like, I'd be. Well,
no, I'm saying I'm not. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm not romantic about documentaries because I recognize the narratives that they're. I recognize that they're narratives. I recognize that it's not pure, unadulterated reality that they're giving me. I recognize it's something that the directors and cinematographers and editors and voice actors, narrators chose to do. It's giving you it's imparting a message on you, and you take every message for granted because because you should, because no one is infallible. I'm definitely not romantic about documentaries.
Yeah, I find them for the reasons you just said. I actually find them to some degree concerning because I'm trying to think of if I want to how cutthroat I want to be with the language choice or how dismissive I want to be. There are a lot of people, and it's on the left and the right, and libertarians. I mean, trust me, I know for libertarians and people of that ilk too. But to some degree, there's this saying that people don't have ideas; ideas have people. And I think some people do have ideas, and I think a lot of ideas have people. And documentaries that are well done and they are evocative in some way, and then they do tell a story. I do get concerned that their goal is less to raise questions. Like for you and I, they raise questions. That's why we could talk about for an hour, right? With these, really, we talked about for an hour, didn't have any trouble. It brings up a lot of points that are worth mentioning. There's a lot of rabbit holes to go into. There are a lot of people who do consume their information on this thing seems reputable, this is a convincing narrative, and they are programmed to have the correct takeaways. And I could see, I mean, I guess I'll state my bias up front, but I don't really respect, I don't respect BBC as an organization. And Curtis has done documentaries for BBC. I'm not saying that taints him for me, but I'm saying, yeah, I could see this content being the type of content that if I was in college and I was going out with a girl who's kind of smart, she might quote things from this as if they're the gospel, right? And it's not because Curtis did anything wrong. It's because the whole medium and the form and the way content is delivered and the way people unfortunately interact with content does make people programmable in a lot of ways. And that's not to be right wingers do it too, right? That's the whole thing of why people hate on Fox News. But that's not a criticism of Curtis. It's just a criticism of maybe why I'm less hesitant to buy into evocative documentaries that maybe spin narratives. I'm more like, I'm going to start from the premise that this narrative is kind of complete junk, and I'm going to scrutinize it rigorously. But he can only put so much in a 3-hour documentary, right? So he might have better points or points I'm more sympathetic to. Maybe they just didn't make the cut.
Well, you see, this is probably my cynicism showing. But I generally assume, whether it's a podcast, a book, a documentary, whatever, I start, reading or watching or listening to that thing under the assumption that they have some ideological concept or some ideology, some overarching worldview that they want to impart to me. And they're trying to persuade me of this, that, or the other thing. Maybe they're right, maybe they're not right, maybe it's nefarious, maybe they're doing it for nefarious reasons, maybe it's entirely unconscious. Aristotle says man is the ideological animal. Aristotle says man is the rational animal. Maybe we should rather say man is the ideological animal. But this is why I end up bringing up someone like Slavoj Žižek, because Slavoj Žižek talks about how the inherent ideology in everything, or the inherent ideology in everything from the person who tells you to buy organic apples at the store to the billboard advertisements you see when you're doing a road trip across the U.S. So you're bringing up a problem, I guess, which is how do we get people to be less how do we get people to be more critical of the media they consume? How do we get people to be less less willing to just be receptacles of other people's ideas? I guess I don't really, that's sort of a issue I don't have an answer to, but this is why it's actually, here's a funny example, I guess it's related. I was on the Trump subreddit the other day, because because I like keeping an eye on those people every now and then. And one of the posts was a link to a Guardian article about there's an author who is writing a version of 1984 from Julia's perspective. And they're not. I mean, we're not getting rid of the original, right? She's just writing another novel. She's taking the plot line, but she's writing another novel only from a different character's perspective. And the people in the subreddit were very upset about this because they thought this was an example of the left's, the left wanting to shove feminist propaganda down our throats, and people were literally comparing it to 1984, comparing it to trying to get rid of something in the past and replacing it with something politically correct now. And I mean, whatever your opinions, I guess, on feminism, that didn't, and I read the article. I read the Guardian article, by the way, and it didn't bother me at all, actually, because either it's terrible propaganda, either it's badly put together propaganda, or it's an interesting piece of literature, which you could say is is propaganda, which is well put together. But that's the nature of, I guess, media, whether it is a novel or a documentary. So as long as the individual, and this is why, I mean, this is why you're bringing up the point, because a lot of people aren't able or willing to do this, but as long as the individual can keep that in the back of their mind, then it doesn't immorally outrage me to know that, this person has this opinion and they put it in a documentary, or this person has this opinion and they put it in their novel.
You're making me feel better about the point I made, where every word should be thought of in terms of degrees, right? So it's in a way, how Zizek says is everything is propaganda or ideological. Everything's ideological to a certain point, but it's okay, in what way is an ideological? Is it serving this? What are acceptable levels of things being ideological in certain levels of discourse, and just stuff like that too? Because it's I truly am bothered when they take something and then they or it's not, I don't really care about 1984 as a piece of literature that much. It emblemizes fine points that are relevant, but it's not my favorite book or anything. But I am bothered when I hear a movie's coming out and it looks okay, and I go and see it and it feels overwhelmingly like bad propaganda. It kind of upsets me. I'm I can't believe enough people went into the production of making this awful piece of propaganda. And I know that a lot of people watch this, and because they're not aware in certain ways, it's not even that certain people are going to agree with the propaganda, but it's some people will just accept it in a way that does bother me. But yeah, that whole story does sound kind of ridiculous on the rewriting, or the other angle on 1984, because I could see that being interesting. I generally have no interest in it though. But it's yeah, outrage is selective, outrage, yeah, all that. But that's kind of you did raise the point. If people are going to act this way about things, what is to be done about it? And I made this joke, and it was probably rude when I was arguing with the leftist, but they were kind of okay, well, everything has these stuff, and it's all these biases, or people act poorly under information. And I'm yeah, so that means I win the tie, because in my world, right, nobody can violently impose it on other people. so that's the joke I like to make there. But if you're going to honestly ask, how do you reckon with this, how people are programmable, I think there's certain people who think like I do that kind of get it. It's intensely, you have to be intensely political and Machiavellian, and then you have to remove the power when you finally have the chance. It's you have to get there, you might have to do underhanded tactics, because those are what works. You might have to make your own bad propaganda if that's what works, unfortunately. It's maybe some people do have to stoop to that level of what I would call borderline mind control, because that's what I think is happening on the other teams. You can't just say this is bad and then not play by it if it's what's keeping you from enacting, the worldview that is better. But yeah, that's a conversation for a different time, probably. Do you want to have any final thoughts before we close up?
So I guess, yeah, my final thought will be, it's actually connected to the other documentary, the other Adam Curtis documentary I mentioned, Can't Get You Out of My Head, because he makes a point in that documentary, which I think does connect to this one, and that point was psychologists in the 20th century were, I mean, it was influenced by the movement known as behaviorism. You know, it doesn't really matter what goes on in the headspace. What matters is how people are behaving, and that tells you the true, that's all the information you really need about psychology, about the mind. This elusive concept of the mind, they sort of tried to do away with. And they were like, well, then if you influence people's behavior, then you are, you can sort of change, you can change their reality. You can change how they're feeling, how they're thinking, what they're thinking. I mean, B.F. Skinner tried to do this with rats. But then what the psychologists, I think, ultimately realized was people are less, like, we understand the human mind less than we think we did, and people are even less malleable than we think we did. People like, so I guess I'm sort of raising the question at the end, as I always do. I never answer questions; I just ask them. I'm raising the question: how malleable ultimately are people? And like when it comes to things like system building, do these systems ultimately collapse or fail because people? And I don't want to use the word free will or freedom, but do people have more agency than we think they do? I think it's worth pondering.
Yeah. And that has a lot of implications too, because it's like when I talked about being programmable, it's like, well, does it mean they're equally programmable over their lifetime, or is it like a lot at once and then you're relatively locked in? Or is it only in degrees after, or are there rare exceptions, or to what extent, right? That's what the example $1 million question always is to what extent.
The example used in the other documentary was, I think it was MK Ultra, where they give people insane amounts of psychedelics, and the only thing what the psychologists really were trying to do, well, first they wanted to wipe a good deal of your previous memory, and then they wanted to insert new memories into you. And they succeeded in wiping people's a lot of people's memories of their past. What they were not successful at was putting in the new memories that they wanted the people to think were their memories all along. And I mean, that's one experiment. But I think that sort of shows that people might be less malleable, less manipulative, and they might have more ability to make their own choices than people was once assumed. Because Curtis is saying we're not machines, or we shouldn't think of ourselves as machines, and maybe that's one reason why the machine analogy doesn't make sense, because as we all know, we in this culture, we've absorbed the science fiction idea of a cyborg, of a robot that basically is a human because it has the same thoughts, feelings, and internal life of a human. And computers have gotten extremely advanced, but what they haven't seemed to have created is cyborgs. They haven't created a consciousness in an artificial, out of artificial material. And that sort of tells me that the machine analogy is flawed. Because if it were more exact, then I think it would be easier to create AI, but it's not. So there's obviously other things going on that we're not taking into account that mean that the brain, that you can't just say a brain is a computer. It does a lot of things similar to a computer. Some, does some things better than a computer, some things worse than a computer. But there's that, I guess, sense of identity or sense of experience that apparently a computer does not have.
Do you mind if I build off that a little bit too? Because so one idea I've been having a lot lately is people like to think in absolutes and not ranges. So I was joking around with somebody because I was on a panel that interviewed somebody, and you can imagine like if you interviewed like a dozen people and you had to like score them on say 10 different things, like maybe intelligence and problem solving are two, for example. You can interview two people and you could say this one was a 75 in intelligence and a 70 in problem solving. This person was a 70 in intelligence and 75 in problem solving. Well, you only interacted them in a certain amount of time. So both of them probably exist in a range, depending on scenarios, of how smart they are and how well they problem solve. So it's like really one of these people might be like a 65 to 85 in terms of intelligence situationally, and the other one might be like a 50 to 75. But you observe one absolute point and you're unable to conceptualize it as you're talking with somebody who has different ranges and you reach certain ones in different moments. And that's the type of uncertainty that I feel like when people use the machine phrase, it lasts so long. So like you and I have very different brains. Let's say your brain doesn't process dopamine the way my brain processes it. You might go to the doctor and they might say your brain is malfunctioning. Why is it malfunctioning? Well, your tool, right, your machine processes this at a different rate than the average. And it's like, well, maybe most people operate in certain ranges and then some small amounts of people fall outside of certain ranges in different parts of the brain. Well, we're all machines, because if you could actually take one person and you could break down all the parts of the brain and all the things that go into it, you could take in the literal inputs, the literal outputs, and you could see that depending on how it's functioning, it is working like a machine. But it's like, well, guess what? Too many people operate in different range. Too many people have heightened amygdalas or not very sensitive amygdalas. And it's like, this is why we aren't machines, right? It's because everybody as an individual is a machine, but everybody operates in this like wide range to where the inputs don't equal outputs for everybody. That's where the analogy fails. And that's where the fragile system builders fail, because they say you are a machine, you have these parts, but they don't understand the individuality of each machine that make up. Even though we all fall in a range, it's still different enough in different parts. And it's like, this is the hard thing to conceptualize. So yeah, I had to be autistic about that for a second. I'm gonna say we're good. We covered we covered Curtis for Adam Curtis, right? Adam Curtis's documentary for about an hour 20, and I thought it was it's at least worth watching if you're curious too. It's easy to find on YouTube or Odyssey if you just search it. Did you want to give the name of it again? Because I don't have that written down in front of me. It's kind of a long name.
Yeah, it's all watched over by machines of loving grace. If you just Google thoughtmaybe.com, you will find the document. You'll find several of Adam Curtis's documentaries on that particular website. I would recommend you watch it. I think it has something for everyone to ponder, even if it is a propaganda.
And if you're like me and you're picky about how you consume media and you like to be able to adjust the speeds or something, or if it is on Odyssey, it's really easy to find on Odyssey, and then you can download it and put it through like VLC or something to speed it up, or watch it in your preferred way. So it is very accessible. On that note, we appreciate they took the time to listen to another episode of Beyond Talking Points. You can find our backlog of episodes by going on any podcatcher, searching Beyond Talking Points. We cover all kinds of stuff, from like random debates we've talked about to a couple movies we've talked about at this point. We've also had guests like Keegan and Kohei on in the past who have contributed their pretty novel thoughts, and we've had discussions with them on all wide range of things. So if you did enjoy listening to this, feel free to just scan. You could see some of the titles that we talked about. I'm sure something will jump out to you. And we've covered a lot of stuff similar to what we ended up talking about today, in different ways and different arguments. And it's always fun. I'm going to say where you can find my stuff, and then you could say where you can find your stuff, and I'll sign us out. You can find me on Twitter at Matthew T. Keck. I also have the Obey podcast, which I have not been doing lately, but there is backlog content there. I keep getting really good ideas of like really high level stuff to try to tackle on there. Like I'm like, wow, I really want to look at this white paper about cryptocurrency policy from the Brookings Institute and why this might be a really scary intrusion on financial privacy. And then I remember that I have a job and I don't want to have to read enough stuff to actually benchmark how fascist the Brookings Institute is. And the issue is you have to have the baseline of how fascist something is to actually be able to make this, a 30-minute argument worth doing. So that's given me some troubles when I've thought about maybe more original content. But at least that's rolling around in the back of my head. At least maybe just go and subscribe to that. And then when I do put something out, it'll alert you. But that's the Obey podcast. You can find that on any podcatcher. And Matt, your stuff, because I'm having a hard time remembering all of it.
Well, I guess the only thing I'll mention right now is you can, well, two things. You can look at my YouTube channel, The Anti-Philosopher. And you can also look up my podcast, my solo podcast, The Philosopher's Guide to the Apocalypse. I actually just did an episode. I published it yesterday with Carl, a conversation with Carl Nord, who's a very interesting person to talk to. I'm a university student, so I haven't had a lot of time to publish much of my content recently as well, but hopefully I'll get more into a routine of that at some point. I have a Twitter. Oh, what is it? Matthew. Oh, I remember now. It's Matthew. If you just look up Matthew Hazel Woe, but it's the Woe after it. Well, my name's Matthew Hazelwood, as you see on the screen, but it's Matthew Hazel Woe 8. Something like that. I've actually forgotten what my Twitter handle was.
Premium Twitter handle. I think that's right, and that's the thing I was struggling to remember. So I made you say it. Usually I have that down pat in my head. It's just been a minute. Well, once we get back in the swing of doing things regularly, I'll be able to like spit it out there in like 15 seconds. But we've had a bit of a stop.
We need like soundboy. We need to start running this show like NPR with sound bites, like a scripted intro, a scripted outro.
Yeah, but every now and then,
throw in some sponsors from some something related to American
underwear. We have to talk about
American industrial. Oh no, I was going to say the military, something related to like the military.
Oh yeah, we should have interludes where we're sponsored by the Rand Corporation, right? Something like that. That'd be good. Oh God, I don't want to get in trouble that bad though. Okay, but we appreciate you guys listening and sign off for now. Is Matt. Thank you.